Hi, this is Professor Lightby. Welcome to Psych 101. I'm going to give a lecture narration that basically covers why we do psychological science and how we do psychological science. So let's get started. So as you have read, hopefully you guys have started reading this semester, psychology is the science that studies behavior and mental processes. So what do we mean by science and by research? Well, when we talk about what we mean by research, what we mean by science, we mean methods of observation that basically exclusively use the scientific method. Now, what is the scientific method? Well, there are some key components. First of all, the scientific method involves empirical external observation. Okay, it's all based on what can be seen or measured. Okay, it's based on observation, external observation, observation outside of ourselves. And that observation is observation that is systematic, objective, and the first word there, repeatable. Okay, so what do we mean by this? This means if I do a psychological study, okay, and I report the methods that I use, that those methods can be repeated precisely to confirm the results that I may have found. So when we report a scientific finding, it's something that really only counts if it can be repeated. Okay, if you say, well, I did this, and you don't explain how you did it or provide your methods, and it's not a repeatable observation, we have no basis for trusting that observation. By systematic, as we'll see, scientific methods involve systematically observing with certain rules, not just casually observing. And the observation is objective. That is, it doesn't make use of interpretation, subjective kinds of perception, that the method of observation is objective. The person who is doing the observing is not interjected into the observation. And finally, a key component of the scientific method is the idea of control, okay? And this is especially the case if we can do an experiment, okay? Experiments and observation in general involve being able to control the observation, to control the setting under which the observation will take place, to hold constant various variables that are extraneous to our interests, to use the same controlled method of observation on a case-by-case basis, continuously, and for every observation that we make. Now, the question might be, so why do we need a science of psychology? Well, there are a number of reasons, okay? First of all, it's hard to be objective about the subject of most study, ourselves, okay? So we need to harness our observation into an objective system, okay? Because it's very difficult to observe ourselves to people, the subject of most psychological study, in a way that's objective, because it's hard to be objective, okay, unless we put some rules into the matter about this very important topic, namely ourselves. Now, we have lots of preconceptions, okay, and they're not always valid, okay, especially because they're based on personal experiences which are not the same for everyone. So our preconceptions, and much of this course will involve looking at how we form preconceptions and how they affect our perception, okay, and our interpretation of our world, okay. We need to move them aside, and that's what scientific methods are designed to do. observation, unless we harness it, okay, into a systematic scientific observation, is imperfect. It's biased. Okay, we have those preconceptions, bias how and what we see. Okay, if we rely on our memory for things that have happened to us or to others in the past, memories are notoriously fallible, okay, and biased. And they also serve the self. For example, we tend to more readily remember our successes than we do our failures. Okay, we more readily remember information out there that is consistent with our, for example, stereotypes, then we remember information that is inconsistent with those. It's one of the reasons stereotypes are hard to undo. Okay, we'll get into that much later at many points in this course. Behaviors have multiple complex and unseen causes. So what you are watching, okay, or observing in a casual way, okay, you may see some sort of behavior that leads to some sort of outcome or some sort of behavior on the part of another person. You might see some factor being introduced into the environment that seems to change behavior. And you might be led to think that, oh, well, there's the cause, okay, there's the effect. But there are, in all likelihood, other possible causes. Behaviors are caused by multiple things in complex kinds of interacting ways, okay? And we need a science, as we'll see, a scientific methodology to tease out those multiple complex and potentially unseen causes. A subheading to this is that, as my previous discussion implies, all relevant information not be present. You see what seems to be the cause, but that's not everything that may be involved and actually be present in the situation. Okay. Okay. And then there's this whole idea of the hidden power of the situation. People have a very strong tendency to underestimate how important situational kinds of variables are. Okay, so we tend to see cause in the internal state or nature of the person engaging in the behavior, and tend to miss quite often. This becomes a major topic and focus of social psychology. The power, situational variables out there in the environment that might be pulling for the behavior, okay, to occur that we don't visibly see, okay. So, for example, there have been numerous studies that have been done in which people have been engaged in a particular kind of behavior. An observer is, an observer is asked to kind of explain, so, what's the cause of that behavior? Why did the person do that? The tendency is to say, well, it's that's part of the person's personality, okay? And this might be true even when we see that the person that's been observing has seen the person being kind of subtly asked to do something, okay? And ends up doing it, and it's not something that seems consistent with what the person would ordinarily do. And we tend to see that as the person's behavior is the cause and miss the power of the situation. Okay, and this leads us to the whole idea of telling more than we can know. Okay, this is the idea that much of what affects our behavior, much of the decision making and the judgmental kinds of processes that go on, that are behind our behavior, okay, are occurring at a mental level, a cognitive level that's beyond our cognitive reach. Okay, we can't be consciously aware of all those higher order mental processes that are going on. So, for example, there have been some very really nice, compelling examples of how we may behave in ways that we're not really aware, okay, of what caused us to do something, okay, and we give an explanation. We'll give an explanation, which what seems to be the rational, logical one. We'll tell why, okay, we did it, but we're not really in touch with the real reasons we do this. Let me give you an interesting example, a couple of interesting examples. So um, there's imagine that you're in a mall, okay, and you take part in a customer marketing survey, okay, and the experimenter wants you to, or uh, the person who's running these little marketing studies gives you the task of evaluating pairs of various kinds of hosiery or socks, okay, and basically what your task is to do is to um, three different pairs of black stockings are presented. Okay, 1, 2, and 3, left, middle, and right. Okay, and so the marketer tells you, the interviewer asks you to take a look at these and then tell me which one you like the best. Okay, and so you feel each of them and you stretch them and you look at them and you kind of like get a feel for them, and then says, oh, so which one do you like the best? Which one would you buy? And you give an answer. Well, I'd buy this one, and it's the one on the left. Okay. Uh, and then the person, the interviewer says, well, why is that your favorite one? Okay. Well, it seems to have a better texture. You say, I kind of like the feel of it. I like the looks of it. It stretches nicely and things like that. Okay. And the interviewer says, okay, well, this kind of study was actually done, okay, and a couple hundred people went through this, okay, and they made their preferences, okay. Um, about 60% of those people, okay, chose the item that was on their left side, item number 1. Think of 1, 2, 3, okay, as the one they preferred, okay, and the other 40% picked 2 or 3, which the researchers found very, very curious, because in every single case, it was exactly the same product in position 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so it could not have been the reasons that people gave for why they chose number 1, but rather it has to do with um, something about the situation. Okay, and something about, maybe it's because we tend to read left to right, or examine things left to right, and that there's a kind of a primacy effect, so that the first kind of item we test out, we have kind of an implicit preference for. Okay, so it was the location of the item, not anything that people gave as the reasons for preferring it, that had the effect. So people were telling more than they could know. Okay, people did not have access to whatever higher order mental processes were involved in making them choose the one on the left. The reasons they gave were not the right reasons. Okay, were not the true reasons for why they chose that. And they couldn't be, because when they kept saying this is a better product, this is a softer product, etc., well, all the products, all the socks were the same. Another example is the well-known something known as the halo effect. why the halo effect is this idea that um, your your first impression, okay, um, of something tends to guide how you look at and interpret um, that stimulus in the future. So if you have a positive first impression of a person or some other kind of uh, stimulus, okay, you're going to um, um, obviously not prefer that, okay, because you have a positive impression, but how you perceive other aspects of it is going to be influenced by that initial impression. So it's as if you have a halo around you, okay. But we're not necessarily consciously aware of the halo effect, okay. In fact, if we were, we would probably take be on guard to protect ourselves from being overly influenced by our first impression. So imagine this study. Okay, this is a study that was done at the University of Michigan. So students of uh, uh, big sections of psychology, okay, lectures, okay, were asked to watch um, a videotaped interview of a new professor that was being um, um, that had been done by the local campus TV station. So the students were asked to watch this videotaped interview, and it was of this male young professor. Um, and he was asked a number of questions about his research and how he's adjusting to I guess living in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and being a professor, and what is what his likes and dislikes and his hobbies and his research and his teaching was all about. Um, and one of the first questions was, so what do you think of the students at the University of Michigan so far? And there were two conditions. In one case, the professor basically just complimented them very profusely. Okay, oh, I love the students here. They seem so motivated, so interested, so interesting. It's a great environment because of these great students. Okay, so we said really nice things about students. Okay, in the other condition, now it's the same professor, dressed the same way. Everything is the same, but he kind of like was very negative about students. I haven't been so impressed. They don't seem so motivated. Not as smart as I thought they'd be. Said negative things. Okay. After that, so we have these two conditions. Same professor being interviewed. Okay. But one says good things about students. The other says kind of negative things about the local students. After that, the interview is exactly the same. Okay, same questions, same answers, same videotape. Just had these differences at the beginning spliced in. Okay, um, and so this professor, he spoke with a kind of a slight German accent. He was dressed in a tie with a sport coat. Um, Relatively attractive guy. Um, Had an interesting kind of history, um, um, and gave kind of, he just basically described his work and and his interest. Okay, so after the interview is done, the students in both conditions are asked to kind of judge this guy. Okay, first of all, how much do you like him? Okay, well, as you might expect, they liked the professor more when he said good things about them, okay, and less when he had said negative things about them, okay. That's understandable. That makes a ton of sense. They were also asked, so how interesting do you find his research? Okay, would you like to take a course from this person? Okay, how well dressed was he? Okay, uh, Please rate him in terms of physical attractiveness. Okay. Um, was he easy to understand? Please rate the extent to which his accent was something, how favorable it was for you to listen to. On every single one of those questions, people gave lower ratings to the person that had insulted students, okay, than they did to the person who had said positive things about students. Okay, so what's going on here? Okay, um, well, students are asked, okay, why did you rate his accent as unpleasant? Why do you think he's not so um, uh, so well dressed, or in the unfavorable condition? And they said, well, because he wasn't, because his accent was unpleasant, so on and so forth. Okay. Well, do you think possibly it might be the case that the fact that you kind of rated him low in terms of whether you liked him could have had something to do with that? And to a one, the students would say, no, it goes the other way. I didn't like him so much because of all of these negative qualities that he had. But that couldn't be the case, because the differences, when they liked him, they gave had very positive impressions of exactly the same things that were witnessed in the other condition. So it was clearly the case that a halo effect was operating, that their perceptions, okay, their interpretations of all these things about the professor, the quality of his research, how knowledgeable he was, how attractive he was, how well dressed he was, how pleasant his accent was, and so on, were influenced by their liking. Okay. Yet, students seemed completely unaware of this. Okay. So that is an example of being influenced by things that you didn't think you were influenced by, and giving reasons for why you have certain judgments, okay, that are not really the true reasons, okay? And this is another reason why we need a science of psychology. We can't just rely on our introspection, or our, shall we say, observation of ourselves, okay? Our explanations aren't necessarily in touch with the true explanations, because we don't have access to the higher order mental processes that it's integrating all of this kind of information. Hence, another reason for why we need a science of psychology. And finally, we have natural thinking tendencies that can mislead us. And of course, the halo effect, this selective perception based on initial preference, um, is an example of a natural thinking tendency that can, in fact, mislead us. But we can also talk about some natural thinking tendencies that are talked about in your textbook as well. Um, so the textbook talks about hindsight bias, judgmental overconfidence, and the tendency to perceive patterns in random events. Okay, so this pursues further the imperfection of intuition, relying on common sense, relying on interpretations that we think we believe are accurate. Let's look at a couple of these. Overconfidence. Well, people tend to think they know more than they do. This occurs both in academic and social behavior. Okay, I believe in your textbook there's this example about how many seconds do you think it would take you to unscramble each anagram here. Okay, that's the unscrambling. Okay, well, as it turns out, okay, I should probably back up there. Whoops. Um, yeah. as it turns out, people give much think that on average, the average estimate is much faster than it really takes people. Okay, if they see the answer, they see these and, oh, I'll be able to do that quickly. Okay, and that's particularly quicker than they actually could do it. Okay, so people, especially if they see the answer in advance. Okay, they look at this. People look at this. Say, oh, I could probably do that in about minute or so. Okay, but other people who are just given them take considerably longer than that. So we tend to be overconfident. Okay. Um, we tend to perceive order in random events. Okay, um, so here's a good example. During the 2010 World Cup, a German octopus selected the right box and correctly predicted the outcomes of Germany's matches with Spain. Okay, was it random or remarkable? Okay, a lot of people said, no, that was very, very remarkable. They couldn't believe that this could just be a random kind of thing. Okay, lots of things happen, and you should read more about this in the textbook modules. Okay. And then there's the hindsight bias. This is the tendency to believe, after learning an outcome, that we could have predicted it. Okay. So, you knew you'd be accepted into this college. Okay. And the classic example is after watching a competition. If you don't make a prediction ahead of time, you might make a post-diction. I figured that person would win because blah, blah, blah. Okay. There's many examples of the hindsight bias. Some of the most interesting ones come from looking at presidential elections. Okay. So, for example, if we go back to the Obama Romney 2012 election, when random samples of people were asked before the election, okay, who they thought would win, okay, I think it was something like 57% or something like that predicted Obama would win the election. Okay, that number might be higher or low, but it's not particularly relevant. After as in absolute terms, after the election, another big random sample is taken, and people are asked, well, before the election, okay, who did you think was going to win? Okay, and like 75% of the people said, oh no, I knew Obama was going to win. But clearly that couldn't be the case, because beforehand only 57% of the people are saying this. After the fact, 75% of the people said, oh, they knew he would win. Okay, so that's a good example of the hindsight bias. Now, that happens with psychological research. Oh, that finding was obvious. I could have told them that. Why'd they have to go and spend money? Have to have a grant government money just to find that result? I could have told them that was a really obvious effect. But let's look again. Okay. So look at all these sayings. Okay. They all make sense, right? Absence makes the heart grow fonder. Birds of a feather flock together, just to take a few. In hindsight, after we read them, yeah, that makes sense. It's understandable why these sayings exist. I call them grandma's folk sayings, okay? But if we think a little bit more about it, why do these other phrases also seem to make sense? Okay. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, but hey, out of sight, out of mind. Okay. Which seems to be the opposite. Okay. Birds of a feather flock together. Well, when you see a couple very similar to each other really grooving, okay, you're going to say that. But there's also the saying that opposites attract. Okay, um, etc., etc. I could go down the list, and you can look at this list at your leisure. Okay, so we'll probably post these slides as an outline. So obviously, there's something wrong with the concept of obviousness. Okay, and basically, the whole idea is that everything seems obvious after we know the result. Okay, um, but in advance, we don't necessarily know. Okay, so it's very easy to see the results of studies demonstrating that um, a particular finding, and you learn about it and say, oh, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, of course, how could it be different? Well, if the opposite result was presented to you, you'd probably say the same thing. Okay. So we have to get this obviousness idea that something is obviously wrong with the concept of obviousness. Okay, and hindsight bias is a big mover of that. Okay, so keep that in mind. It's probably the case that all of these statements have some truth. Okay, even though they're opposite, because as the conditions vary, okay, the relationship may vary. Okay, so yeah, under certain circumstances, okay, and this is what psychology needs. I mean, that is usually on the hunt for. Under what conditions does this hold true as opposed to that? Okay, because at some level, just most things are true at least some of the time. Okay, and not everything. I mean, it's never true that the Earth is flat, right? But you understand the point. Okay, let's move on and talk about research methods. So there are three key research approaches, okay? Descriptive, correlational, and experimental. Descriptive research, okay, involves observing and recording behavior without producing any causal explanations. Okay, we're just describing the lay of the land here. Okay. Correlational research adds another layer. Okay. Now we observe and measure, okay, without manipulating two or more variables, okay, to see if they're kind of related to each other. Okay, are they related such that as one changes, so does the other? Does the presence of one does it tend to be associated with the absence of the other or the presence of the other, and things like that. Okay, correlation research allows us to learn about the relationships between variables. So descriptive and correlational methods, there are a number of them. So a case study is an in-depth study of a single participant. Of a person, for example, there's the famous case of Sybil, the person who was studied for many years. It was a movie that Sally Field took the lead role of this person who seemed to have what at that time were called multiple personalities. Okay, she had 16 different versions of herself that would come out and dominate her consciousness at various different times. Okay, we now call that dissociative identity disorder. It's very rare. Okay, but she was studied. Very in depth. Okay, a very in depth, years long study by psychiatrists and psychologists of this person. Okay, but there can be a case study of an organization or of a group. Okay, so the whole idea of groupthink, what happens to decision-making groups under certain circumstances, was first understood by studying um, um, the President Kennedy back in the 60s and his cabinet and some of the decisions they made. Okay, um, and, and what went wrong with those decisions and perhaps why in terms of the dynamics of the group. That would be a case study. Naturalistic observation involves actually observing and recording behavior, okay, in the natural state or habitat of the observee, okay, the subject, okay. So one example, it might be questioning distance by lawyers during direct versus cross-examination. What's this about? Well, this was an interesting study in which the researchers basically were testing a psychological hypothesis, okay, having to do with what psychologists at that time had learned about um, personal space invasion, if you will, okay. So it's understood that if strangers or someone you don't want to be in your face gets really, really close to you, okay, invade your personal space, you've heard the term, that creates anxiety, it makes you nervous, it makes you look nervous, okay. And the question was, do lawyers intuitively understand this, okay? And does it affect how they question people in courtrooms, okay, witnesses in courtrooms? So what the researchers did was they were able to get permission to observe some cases, okay, some courtroom testimony, and they were able to record several distances that the lawyers kept, okay, from the witness on the witness stand as they questioned them. So there was two kinds of lawyers. There were, well, the two variables were whether or not the witness, I should say there were two kinds of witness, was being directly examined by their lawyer, okay, the lawyer that called them to the stand, okay, or whether there was or whether they were being cross-examined by the other lawyer, the opposite side. And the other variable was what kind of distance did the lawyers keep, okay. So that was measured, okay. So what they found was that lawyers who were questioning their own clients, their own witnesses, okay, kept a greater distance, okay, than lawyers who were questioning witnesses on the other side, who were cross-examining witnesses. If you're doing cross-examination, you're a lawyer, the distance is shorter. You're getting in the person's face. You're trying to make them be nervous and look nervous to the jury. But if it's your own client, all right, okay, you keep a greater distance. Give them their space. Let them look more relaxed and perhaps more credible to the jury. Okay, so there was a relationship. Okay, if the witness is your witness, you keep distance. Okay, if it's another, if you're cross-examining the other side's witness, you get in their face. Okay, so we see a correlation. Archival research involves finding and scoring information in historical and public records. Okay, so one of the classic examples is a study done many, many years ago to test a hypothesis that frustration, okay, that is having a goal blocked, is likely to tends to be associated with greater aggression, okay, and so that when you're frustrated, when there's some frustration, you're going to aggress. Now, often you can't aggress against the target, okay, of your or source of your frustration. So, what the theory back then was that you might displace your aggression onto some innocent target, okay. That's called scapegoating, okay, or displaced aggression, okay. So to test this hypothesis, what the researchers did was they took about 50 or so years of dating back to the into the 18 from the later 1800s into the early 1900s. Okay, um, early to mid 1900s, not mid, but I'd say from the 1870s to the 1920s. Um, so they got the measure. They were able to measure from the archives, from the records. Okay, what cotton prices were like for Southern farmers for that year, and they also measured the number of lynchings, mainly of blacks. Okay, um, that occurred that particular year in the South. Okay. Now, if the hypothesis is true that frustration is associated with aggression, okay, then low cotton prices should be a source of frustration, okay, leading to a desire to aggress, okay, um, and aggression might be manifested in this scapegoating, this lynching, okay, aggressing against an innocent party, okay, and that's exactly what they found. The lower the price of cotton for a given year in the South of the Southern United States, the greater the number of lynchings that occurred. Okay, so that's called a negative correlation. As cotton prices went down, lynchings were higher. Okay. You might do archival research where you go to the records, you look at a number of cases, many trials. Okay, look at whether there was a conviction or an acquittal. Okay, and compare that to whether and then look at whether or not there was an eyewitness or not an eyewitness in that case, and you might find that conviction rate was higher when there was an eyewitness compared to when there wasn't an eyewitness. Okay, so you would have found indeed a correlation between the presence or absence of an eyewitness and whether or not there was a conviction. Okay, survey research. Okay, so that's assessment by questionnaire of a sample or a population. Okay, so for example, you might do a survey where you go out. Okay. Um, and send questionnaires. You might do a survey looking at how much do judges in general know about eyewitness science. You might send them a survey asking them questions, okay, to get an idea of what the level of knowledge is. Okay, that would involve a survey. Okay, so all of these involve. So this involves a single person or a single organization. Here we're observing in the natural habitat, okay, at least a couple of variables, okay. Here we're looking only at records, at the archives, and here we're sending out and taking usually written or spoken kinds of rating scale responses from people, okay. So we've got these methods of doing the research. Okay. All right. So in a case study, okay, can be a source of ideas about human nature in general, but it's kind of hard to overgeneralize. It's easy to overgeneralize from one example. Okay, that might not be a representative kind of example. So one gets into a danger of using that to kind of generalize more broadly beyond one person to people in general. Issues with generalizing here. Naturalistic observation. So usually naturalistic observation is non-participatory and non-obtrusive, that the observer, okay, is not part of the action, okay, but is detached, and the people being observed may not even know they are being observed, okay. That's the preferred way of doing naturalistic observation, but you're studying people, okay, in their natural habitat, in the natural situation in which of real life in which they are behaving. Surveys, okay, I won't belabor the definition. Maybe read it there. Now, it's keys to getting useful information. Wording is really important, and we should only question randomly sampled people. Okay. The representativeness of the sample and the randomness of it is very important in whether you can generalize beyond the survey. This is talked about at sufficient length in your textbook. Okay, wording effects. Okay, important. Also talked about in the text, but wording effects have to do with the results you get from a survey can be changed by your word selection. So, for example, we could ask the question, do you have a motivation to study hard for this course versus do you feel a desire to study hard for this course? Okay. They look very similar, okay, but you may get very different answers, even though because of the wording kind of implies different things. So, for example, here you might get a lot of people saying, yeah, I do have motivation. I want to get a good grade. Okay, but if we exchange motivation with desire, it seems like a synonym, but desire has to do with wanting, okay, more than does motivation. So you might get fewer people saying, I want to study hard for this course if he asks the question this way, because, well, yeah, I'm going to do it. I want to do it. I'm motivated to do it, but do I desire to do it? No, I'm not. I don't really dig studying that much. Okay, but so you might get a very different set of responses to this question to this one, even though they look so similar. So wording is so important. Here's another example. Okay, so this is how the scale can affect. Okay. So how many people are asked, how many hours of TV do you watch? Okay. Some people were given a scale that ranged, think of a linear scale that the low point is up to a half an hour and the high point is more than 2.5 hours. Okay. Under those circumstances, what percent said more than 2.5 hours? Well, 16.2%. Now we ask the same question here, and the scale goes from a minimum of up to 2.5 hours to a maximum of more than 4.5 hours. Okay. In this case, 37, 3 out of every 8 people, okay, said more than 2.5 hours. And if you think about it a little bit, think about these scales and how this would pull for people saying this more so because of the scale. I mean, that's the lower end of the scale, okay? So in order to not say this, you'd have to go to the lowest point, okay? So you can see then how the scale can affect, the variable scale can affect how people respond. Okay, so now we're going to talk about correlational research, looking for associations. And I think this is going to continue on into into a second narration, which we'll post, which I will prepare now, and it'll be in a different video. So long for now. Stay tuned for the next one.